Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be revisiting episode 3, where we ask, what are the most fundamental beliefs of Buddhism? Does Buddhism have an afterlife? Does Buddhism have a Bible like Christianity? We will be discussing what we answered before, how those answers may or may not have changed, and where we stand now on the topic. We hope you enjoy. So let's get started. What are the most fundamental beliefs of Buddhism?
When we last answered this question, we discussed the Dharma, the Four Noble Truths, and the three Dharma seals. We said that the Dharma refers to a number of absolute truths about the universe and about reality and human life that one can come to understand through meditation, practice, and renunciation. These truths include, but are not limited to, the three Dharma seals: emptiness, impermanence, and suffering. These are critically important terms in Buddhism, so let's spend a little time on each one, starting with suffering. Suffering in Buddhism is an English translation of the Sanskrit word dukkha, a translation choice we have heavily criticized. This word does not just refer to intense sadness or distress. More accurately, it refers to the absence of satiation, what the mind would experience if anything was ever permanent and unchanging. It's the desire to experience all pleasant things and no unpleasant things, an impossible desire given how the world works. Impermanence means that nothing in reality exists without changing over time, and is directly implied in suffering. Suffering happens because of the fact that everything is always changing all the time, and satiation cannot be achieved. Emptiness is also directly implied in impermanence. If there is nothing that does not undergo change, then nothing has inherent and substantial existence. This is the most critical teaching in Mahayana Buddhism, though it's still important in other schools of Buddhism as well. We also described a teaching in Buddhism that many in the West are familiar with: karma. Western people often think that karma simply means what goes around comes around. While that's partially true, it's much more complicated than that. Many people think karma means that if they act poorly now, something bad will happen to them soon. But that thinking is on too small of a scale. Karma spans a much larger time scale than one individual's own life, and it's larger than any one individual. It's not my karma or your karma, it's our shared karma. Karma is directly related to the idea of cause and effect implied by the doctrine of dependent origination. But it doesn't just mean that X action causes Y result. Rather, it speaks to the interdependence of all sentient things. This can simply be explained by the idea that my actions don't occur in a vacuum. There's not a single thing I can do, think, say, or believe that doesn't affect another person. Coming back around to this question, my answers have not changed very much. But it's our hope that listeners who have stayed with us for the last 131 episodes since we discussed these topics will now have a deeper understanding and conception of what these teachings imply. We've discussed before how the word Dharma has at least 7 uses and meanings, and even when it just refers to the Buddha's teaching, it simultaneously refers to the way the whole universe works and is organized. It can even be personified and describe its own worship and practice. Looking at the Four Noble Truths, dukkha, desire, the end of dukkha, and the path to the end of dukkha, we've described these and their aspects all in deep detail, and we have also built up a lot having to do with the applications of these truths and their various aspects. As an example, each truth comes with an action item. Dukkha must be known, the cause of dukkha must be terminated, the end of dukkha must be witnessed, and the Eightfold Path must be cultivated. In addition, we come back to the theme of impermanence and emptiness in almost every episode, and we have discussed different interpretations of the meanings and scopes of each of those terms at length. Looking at karma, we've also shown in the texts all the different ways that karma is described to work and how it has applications at many scales of time, numbers of people, and causality. Docs, what do you think?
Regarding dukkha, I think the default translation of suffering has done significant damage to many people's understanding of Buddhism. When the Buddha says that everything in the world is marked by dukkha, he's not saying everything is suffering. I think a more useful translation would be dissatisfaction or anxiety. In that framework, the world is marked by dukkha doesn't mean the world only contains suffering, a dour and pessimistic outlook. It instead means that complete satiation in this world is impossible, something we can observe just by living our lives. Regarding karma, and specifically collective karma, in a more practical framing, you might think of it this way. If you believe in reincarnation, the best way to achieve a good rebirth is if the world you're being born into gets better. That's a collective effort. A better world requires more people doing benevolent things and fewer doing malicious or detrimental things. In Buddhism, this has a supernatural element that extends well beyond this world, just like Buddhist reincarnation itself, but the same principle applies in karma's collective aspect. Regarding emptiness, this is a concept whose exact meaning is difficult to grasp. For example, I still have an urge to pick apart the definitions of the words inherent and substantial existence used previously. That would be outside of today's focus, so not right now. Condensed as much as I can, I'd explain emptiness like this. Since everything and every space thing is impermanent, there's a limit to how important those things can be. Regardless of how much you worked to build or maintain something, it's still going to crumble eventually, or at the very least change into something different than the thing you're working on right now.
Yeah, I think that those answers are very informed by what we've been working on the show for 5 years now, and how the concepts have been developed in the episodes that we've done. I think that your capture of emptiness really makes a lot of sense because it's a very pragmatic or practical way to look at it. Without any of the special metaphysics that a lot of Buddhists have argued over in the texts regarding emptiness, you can kind of look at it and just say, whatever you are doing, experiencing, working on, creating, destroying, that itself is impermanent and will change. And so attaching all kinds of emotional energy to it will ultimately lead to dukkha, this dissatisfaction, this anxiety we've been talking about. So I would stand by all of those answers.
So next, does Buddhism have an afterlife?
Last time when we discussed this, I answered yes and no. We talked about the cycle of birth and rebirth and the realms of transmigration and samsara. We talked about the 6 realms of hell dwellers, preta, animals, people, asuras, and devas. Most Buddhists believe in a cycle of birth and rebirth. We've talked about the 6 realms and the 10 realms, and all of these realms collectively are part of samsara, which is the Sanskrit word that refers to the realm of dukkha, where we are now. To which realm a person is reborn is dependent on a lot of things, including karma, proper death rituals, manner of death, and so on. Since that previous episode, we've talked about the other 4 realms in great detail. These realms are sometimes added on, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, and they are the realm of Arhat, Pratyeka Bodhisattva, and Buddha. In that, we've seen how much more there is to the story of afterlife, or birth and death. We've also described the inhabitants of each of these worlds or realms in samsara, and how Buddhism defines those inhabitants in each realm. In addition, I discussed some of the context around samsara and nirvana. Previously, I said that samsara is often thought of as the mundane world, and nirvana is kind of a paradise. This is partially correct and partially incorrect. Paradise implies a place where you go to, and you are aware, and you have all good and no bad for eternity. Nirvana is the absence of good and the absence of bad. It's freedom from birth and rebirth, from karma, and from the senses and the mind, and from everything that comes with that. It's cognate with a word that means to be blown out or extinguished, and I think that's a good metaphor for it. In that regard, it's not an actual place. Since then, we've described the nature of nirvana in a lot more depth, and we've even read the Sutra describing the Buddha's own achievement of parinirvana. My answers thus have not changed much here either, but again, we have a lot more context and a lot more detail that we've described on the show since we last looked at the topic. Docs, what are your thoughts?
From my perspective, the answer to the question is yes, but the afterlife is more life. Death seems extremely temporary in Buddhism. Depending on how you interpret it, Maybe not so temporary for those who reach nirvana, but that's extremely rare. To me, that qualifies as an afterlife. I also note that a lot of the texts de-emphasize how important that afterlife is. Most of the time when I see references to ways to improve one's next rebirth, it seems like the primary goal is to ease the listeners' and readers' fear of death and what comes after. This is an important role for religion, and I fully support that. But when Buddhism talks about what one should do, it's usually focused on this life. The Buddhist focus is how you can escape the cycle of rebirth right now. If a Buddhist is motivated by desire to be reborn as, say, a deva, they've missed the point.
I would completely agree there as well. The appeasing the fear of death is certainly a huge factor in the early texts especially, and it is a huge factor in all of the doctrines surrounding how to achieve better rebirths. The Buddha knows that people fear what happens after the lights go out. Do they come back on? Do they turn into something different? What happens? And so in the interest of creating a foundation for somebody to build on in this life, here and now, he kind of uses this idea of a better rebirth or a better afterlife as sort of a way to tempt them or a way to appease their interest and speak to their capacity and where they're at in the moment so that he can get them onto the path one way or the other. The Buddha is famous for being said to approach people at their level, at their capacity, and preach to them accordingly. And so this is a perfect example of that sort of thing. And later on in Buddhism, as we've discussed, this whole cosmology gets quote unquote emptied out, meaning that the whole thing is declared as empty or as a skillful means or as, not having any inherent existence. This happens a lot in later Mahayana and in later Vajrayana. And it just demonstrates the point that having this object as a goal, right, being reborn as a deva or being reborn in a Pure Land, these things are only part of the story. The true story and achieving true enlightenment requires you to leave those things behind.
So next, does Buddhism have a Bible like Christianity?
When we last looked at this question, the answer was no. There's no single book or collection of texts that Buddhists study. Rather, there are a number of different canons containing tens of thousands of sutras, essays, and commentaries. You might have heard of the Pali Canon, the Taisho Canon, and there's even also other canons. Different schools of Buddhism emphasize different canons, and many texts are shared between canons. What's important to note is that not every text in the canons is the word of the Buddha, nor was every text or sermon authored during the Buddha's lifetime. In fact, most of them were not authored during the Buddha's lifetime. Going back to this question, the answer is still no. There is no singular holy text, but we have seen that there are single sutras or commentaries that are heavily emphasized in one type of Buddhism or another. For example, we've looked at how the Pure Land Sutras are seen as the framework through which all other sutras should be understood according to Pure Land Buddhism, or how the Avatamsaka Sutra serves that same purpose in Huayan or Kegon Buddhism. I would add to my older answer a discussion of the Tripitaka, which includes the body of sutras, Vinaya rules for monks and nuns, and Abhidharma texts. There are multiple Tripitakas that are organized in different ways and contain different versions of texts, but in the end, the tripartite structure is maintained across most, if not all, of Buddhism. Looking at that may make listeners think of different versions of the Bible, but this too is not a great way to think about it, because each Tripitaka contains hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pages of text. Each Tripitaka also excludes texts found in others. Many of the texts therein have multiple versions or translations, and to my knowledge, none of them have a complete translation into English. In other words, it's impossible to find a complete English translation of an entire Tripitaka. Furthermore, I believe that if one were to read the entire Tripitaka, they'd still have an incomplete conception of Buddhism. In every religious tradition, there is the text, which is static and subject to interpretation, and then there is lived religion, which is fluid, relational, cultural, and ever-changing. Docs, what do you think?
A major advantage that Abrahamic religions have over Buddhism is their broadly united scriptures. different sects may consider some parts of another sect's scripture as non-canonical or apocryphal, but there's still a single book you can study to understand the religion's cores. Buddhism just doesn't have that, and it makes starting out as a Buddhist much harder. The fact that some scriptures actively contradict others complicates things further. Then on top of that, you have later authors who write in the Buddhist voice, speaking their words. The vast distance in both time and context between the authors and us, and the extremely difficult task of translation, additions and alterations when the sermons were transcribed over the years, there is just no unified thing you can read to learn Buddhism. You either have to go to a temple and learn from them, chart your own path through the maze of documents to read, or have a knowledgeable friend who can guide you. Thanks, by the way, Nick.
Yeah, I would agree there for sure. The lack of a centralized and singular core united text is something that makes Buddhism very complicated, but I do enjoy it a lot. It gives basically infinite starting points. It makes it have a high barrier of entry whenever you do start in some cases, but you can start with any text at all, and from there you can find something that's related, and if you continue in that cycle, then you can learn a lot about Buddhism and see a lot of what it has to offer. But I don't recommend this. I wouldn't hit the shuffle button on the Pali Canon, pick something out of there, and start with that. I would start with the first sermon, which we've read and discussed.
Like you said, there's a high barrier to entry, but once you get past that barrier, there's practically infinite depth and infinite content to go through. Like, I could start reading sutras and not stop and take years at that, and I still wouldn't get to the end before I'm too old to continue. So it's a bad thing for starting, but once you get past that start point, it's an endless well.
Exactly.
So, we hope you enjoyed this week's revisit of Episode 3 of Bright on Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing Hawaiian Buddhism. What is Hawaiian Buddhism? What is its history? How does it interact with the tensions surrounding Hawaii's statehood? We hope to see you there.
Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Hi, Nick here, and you've been listening to Bright on Buddhism. Normally at this point in the episode, we would throw to a charity that we think that is deserving of your money or your support. Because there's so much going on right now, we have decided that we're going to open it up to any charity that you think is a good cause to share your resources with. So, if you like our show and would like to support us, please instead give to a charity that you believe does good things for people in need. Thank you.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.